I've seen it. I go online sometimes and I see these articles, these blogs of like how to build quality time together. And they just tell you what to do.
Yeah.
As opposed to, yeah.
You better take up hiking because it's everybody's favorite quality time.
Welcome to Attached, a podcast about the loved ones we're attached to and the good, the bad, and the ugly advice about those relationships that maybe we shouldn't be so attached to. We here at Attached want to share ways to enhance your relationships and debunk all of that bad relationship advice using science. I'm Dr. Patricia Robertson out of the University of Tennessee.
I'm Dr. Sarah Woods at UT Southwestern Medical Center.
And I'm Dr. Sessa Nagash from San Diego State University.
This week, I get to bring you an academic article. Specifically, I found one about socioeconomic differences in the divorce rate, which may be explained by external stressors limiting the time lower income couples can spend together. This week's article is written by Dr. Hannah C. Williamson and Megan T. Schouweiler and published in the Journal of Family Psychology. It is titled Household Income Differentiates Quantity and Quality of Shared Spousal Time. But before we get into it, if you have some new research on relationships that you want us to talk about, send it to us. You can email us at attachedpodcast@gmail.com, tweet us, Facebook us, Instagram us, all at Attached Podcast, or go straight to the source, attachedpodcast.com, and send us a message. To support this podcast and to help us get relationship science out into the world, please go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/attached, and donate. So wherever you listen to our podcast, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and so on, please kindly rate and review it. It helps a lot. All right, are we all ready? Let's get into this episode's article. Sarah, why don't you introduce it for us?
Beautiful. Today, we're taking a deep dive into new research on socioeconomic differences in the divorce rate. In general, we know that the divorce rate has been steady or declining since the 90s, though we're not exactly sure what COVID will do to change those trajectories. But we also know that lower income couples get divorced at higher rates than higher income couples. In other words, the average divorce rate that you probably hear about all the time is hiding that income disparity in divorce. But why are lower income couples' marriages at greater risk? In the early 2000s, there was an assumption that lower income couples valued marriage less or knew less about effective communication. Thankfully, that has been firmly disproved. Prevailing theory now is that lower income couples face many more stressors, which decrease the quantity of time that low income couples spend together and reduce the quality of the shared time that they actually have. Spending time together is key to maintaining a romantic relationship. It gives us the chance to enjoy each other, build memories, offer our partner support, creates opportunities for intimacy. So it tracks that couples who have less of that shared quality time might also experience higher rates of divorce. But this is just a theory, and income-related differences in the quantity and quality of couples' time together has not been rigorously tested. So in this episode, we're diving deep into a new study by Dr. Hannah Williamson and Megan Schouweiler, who set out to test this theory. Patricia, I am so glad that we get to share this time together. So please,
Me too.
Tell us what we need to know about this new relationship science.
Thank you so much. Great introduction. So a little bit of a frame. This is a secondary data analysis, which basically means it's a huge data set that's publicly available, mostly publicly available. And it's also cross-sectional. Specifically, the data set that they used for this study is the American Time Use Survey. And in this study, they were able to use, you guys, this is a big number, so I hope you're sitting, 14,788 participants. Most of these were white, about 71%. Most of them were in fact employed, about 80%, and only about half of them had children living in the home. And we don't know that because they're empty nest and children have left, or if they just do not have children. So this sample specifically, the American Time Use Survey is a much larger sample, but it's only that 14,000 because the authors limited it to only married people and people who were not retired. That working piece is really important because one of the keys to this theory of why lower income couples experience more contextual stress is that lower income couples have greater work stress, including longer commute times because of public transportation, irregular work hours, and more frequently called into work unexpectedly. And they're less able, or they have less time to sync their time off with their spouse. So that the fact that they excluded people who were retired is really key to this study. For socioeconomic status, they calculated income poverty ratio, which is a really clever way. It's not just flat income, it's income, the total household income, the amount of people supported on that income, and the ratio aspect is how much above or below the federal poverty line that couple is. So those main outcome variables, thinking about the quantity and quality of time that they spent together. So for those variables, they used a daily diary survey. And so what they asked the individuals to do, this survey is for a full 24-hour period from 4 a.m. one day to just, I guess, almost 4 a.m. the next day, to report all of their activities seemingly by the minute. Thankfully, they only asked them to do it that 24-hour period. I don't think I could remember what I did the day before, so I'm glad it was only a 24-hour period, and also that I wasn't included in the study. So people reported on the activities that they were doing, how long each activity lasted, where they were during that activity, and who was present for that activity. And that's how they really determine time spent with the spouse in minutes, like I said. So they summed the number of minutes spent in each activity in which the spouse was the only other person present. Now, if they have kids, I imagine that number was quite low. They also excluded time sleeping. So sleeping next to your spouse does not count as quantity or quality time, no matter how much you love sleep. They didn't count it. Grooming or personal/private activities, which they didn't detail what that meant, but I think we all have imaginations. Also, another interesting thing, really cool thing that they did for quality time, they summed also like the specific time that was categorized as leisure or household activities. And leisure and household activities were pre-coded by the secondary data set. All right, so that's quantity of time. It's total summed minutes spent alone with their partner. For quality time, this part of the daily diary, the participants were asked to rate their emotional states at 3 randomly selected activities during those 24-hour period. Specifically, these authors pulled the emotions of stress and happiness during an activity with their spouse. And they could rate how happy or stressed they were, ranging from 0, not at all, to 6, a whole heck of a lot. I don't think those are the exact response ratings, but you get the idea. So as I just explained how they did this quantity and quality aspect, I just want to give a quick shout out to this research team. I have worked, and I know several people have worked with secondary data, and the amount of data cleaning that I assume went into this project is astronomical. So a big shout out to this team for all the work they did, really cultivating these variables and making sure that they were really capturing what they were looking for, that time, quality time, quantity time spent together. Big kudos for that. Okay, So let's talk about the distribution of these variables, like the frequency of each of these variables. So on average, couples spent about 151 minutes alone together in a 24-hour period. That's a little less than 2 hours. So in a 24-hour period, they spent 2 hours, a little less than 2 hours alone together on average. Leisure time was about an hour and a half, 105 minutes, and hours working together on household activities. Hold on to your hats. It's 33 minutes. So don't do a whole lot of joint housework together. I don't blame them. So for happiness, the quality of time that they spent together, overall, it seemed like these couples were fairly happy with the time they spent together. They rated it on average a 4.5 out of 6, so fairly high. And for stress overall, it seemed like they were not terribly stressed during this time either, 1.1 out of 6. Another important aspect was that income poverty ratio that we talked about earlier, and that average was about 340%. So that means it's a 340% above the federal poverty line was the average income ratio for all of these individuals. All right, so what did they find? So first, they did some analyses for the quantity of time couples at the poverty line spent about 144 minutes together on average, but couples 10 times above the poverty line, so pretty high up there, spent about 1.5 times more time together. So couples or individuals in a couple who make substantially more money do spend more time together. I mean, over an hour more together they spend than couples at the poverty line. They actually found that in some moderation analyses that this might be because low-income couples spend significantly less time together on the weekends. So they looked to see if this association differed by the day of the week that they reported on in that 24-hour period. And they found that low-income couples spend a lot less time together on the weekends than their higher income couples. Obviously, they don't know what this is attributed to, but the speculation is different work schedules. Similar patterns were found for specific time together in leisure and household activities as well. Not exactly the same, but fairly similar. One interesting thing I also thought about this study was that couples with children appear to have a reverse effect, whereby low-income couples without children spent more time together than higher income couples without children. There wasn't a time difference by income for people with children, so that those couples without children, you saw a really stark difference in how they spent time together. Okay, we've been talking a lot about the quantity of time. What about this quality of time, that happiness and stress? So for happiness, as a measure of quality of the time they spent together, couples seem to really be equally happy with the time they spent together, even when considering parenting status and days of the week. In this sample, couples, when they did spend time together, they were pretty happy about it, no matter what their income level was. So for stress, there was a little bit of difference. Couples with higher income did report less stress during the time that they spent with their partner. And this effect, in some of the moderation analyses, it might be that this effect is exacerbated by number of hours the couples work in a week, meaning lower income couples who worked fewer hours on average experienced more stress compared to higher income couples who worked a similar number of hours. But there was no difference when working more hours. It was kind of those couples who were working fewer hours experienced more stress if they were lower income. One thing is not clear at all, and it's obviously the way these questions were asked, is where the stress is coming from. the measure of stress, it was just general stress. So we don't know if the stress is stemming from the work environment, from other external factors, or from the couple. It could easily be spillover stress. It was just generally, are you feeling stressed at this moment? A really fascinating study. Before I get into the limitations, I'm so curious, what are you guys thinking? What are your thoughts about the study?
I'm happy to share my thoughts on this article. So I appreciate what you said there at towards the end, PR, about the types of stressors. To me, it seemed like the one thing that kept coming up as I was reading the article, because as we all know, just the type of stress we experience has really significant implications on our relationships, and the way we hold stress in our body physically, right? And how that, I think about, okay, the prescriptions we have around, like, okay, figure out how to spend quality time with your partner, like make it happen. But when it comes to stress in our lives, it's not as easy as turning it on and off. And
Yeah.
I think I keep thinking about, okay, what do we do with this information? And there doesn't seem, at least for me, in a general sense, any easy answers to it, because stress is really something that, as a society, I think we really struggle to manage and cope with. And when it comes to thinking about the impact it has on our romantic relationships, as much as we like to think there's a way to address that in a way that helps our relationships, it is a complex, experience that we have, and it is mental, it's physical, it's cumulative, it's so many things. I think that, reading the article, I thought, okay, this is helpful to be aware of this, but then what do we do with it, right? That kept coming back up for me, and especially not having any clear understanding of what the stressors were that they were talking about. It left sort of a question mark, like, how do we address it if we don't know what the stressors are? Because I think that there's a part of that there's a piece of that for me that's missing, as much as I appreciated the opportunity to have the conversation reading the article.
Yeah.
So at first glance, that's sort of my initial reaction to it.
I think that's a really great point, and obviously beyond the scope of this study, but identifying stressors is key. And if we're thinking about a therapeutic context or a dyadic couple context, sometimes it can be really hard identifying what specifically those stressors are, sometimes labeling them. So that also could be part of the process, is conversations around identifying the stressors, especially if they pile up. Sometimes it's hard to pick one, right? So I think that that's a really great point, is trying to figure out what those stressors are and how we can cope with them.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting result that you're describing, Patricia, that couples who have less income are maybe when they are spending time together, some of that time together is more stressed. But it's hard to sort of understand when you have this other effect of these childless couples, these couples without kids, when they have more time together, because there are not kids in the picture interfering with your every moment. I think that's a lovely universal to take away from this paper, that kids just absolutely tank your time together regardless of income. And it's really, really important that when you have kids, you're probably having to work extra hard to connect. But that then higher income couples invest that time, a lot of that additional free time, in working more.
Yeah.
So it does seem like there could be some really interesting nuance, I think, in what people are bringing into the relationship, and how that's impacting how I'm able to focus on my time with you, which I think teasing out what really matters is important. So not just what stressors are they experiencing and how does it impact the relationship and how does the stress in the relationship flow back outwards, but really teasing out which maybe matters more here, because they've tested quantity and quality.
I see where you're going.
It seems like quantity may matter less than maybe some of the quality of those moments that we're spending. especially if the quality, as Session's talking about, is sort of really impacted by all the stress I'm carrying home with me.
Right. Another building on that, I was really curious, and maybe in the future research of this, the moderating effect of the happiness and stress. Because if you're really happy in those moments and you're also stressed, does that mitigate the negative impact stress has on the relationship? That's something I'm really curious about, is those the contextual, like the together, the emotions that you're feeling, because we could be stressed and happy at the same time. And so what do those look like together? Do they interact with each other, or are they separate constructs that have separate impacts on, could potentially have separate impacts on relationship quality? Obviously, they didn't test that here, but it is a curiosity I have also.
Well, and I think another cool universal sort of finding from this paper, that income was not tied to happiness experience during time with spouse. It doesn't affect how much I enjoy my partner, which I think is a really important takeaway, especially sort of given what we named up front, that historically we have made some really very negative and very awful, inappropriate assumptions about couples living closer to the federal poverty level, that maybe they just don't value marriage as much. And it was such a pervasive belief 30 years ago. It drove a lot of relationship research at that time.
A lot of relationship education, a lot of policy.
And research that didn't result in really anything of value. How ironic. So I think a really important universal that you're describing, that the happiness that I feel when I'm with my spouse was not affected by income.
Something else that sort of stood out to me that, you know, I understand it's secondary data, so it's tricky with that in mind. But when I was looking at some of the demographic data, I had a lot of questions around, given how much when we talk about gender, race, ethnicity, like these things are tried to stress. I was really curious to really understand how those factors really would look based on those groupings, and especially thinking about race and ethnicity, and how susceptible people in certain SES groups are to SES related stress, and thinking about racial stress and all of those things that you can't necessarily, those external, you cannot always, there's no easy answers to managing those things in our lives. So there are, you know, I think opportunities here to expand on this in future studies. But it's also tricky, because when you look at the people who are opting into these data sets, it's 6% African American does not represent the larger community and these other groups as well. So it is sometimes a question, how do we generalize this when we're not capturing everybody? And so I'm mindful of that piece.
Absolutely. And to echo that, we know that the income distribution in our country is not reflective of these demographics either. So maybe it's not as generalizable, but it is a great starting point. Maybe.
I was thinking about, you know, as clinicians on the clinical side of things, what the takeaways are for us, and how this applies to our work, and I'm curious, you know, Sarah as well, us being both like active clinicians, like how do we use this information to not do more harm in terms of like perpetuating any of these, you know, ideas around like how easy it is maybe to just apply quality time and time in your relationship. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, because I had a couple too that I was hoping to discuss.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that although these authors didn't necessarily tease out the relative impact of like quality of time versus quantity of time, for example, they didn't test how it's tied to relationship satisfaction. Right. I might think there is sort of value in inviting couples to have conversations about what quality time looks like for either of them. In other words, when are we both feeling happy and also spending time, just the two of us? What does that look like so we can sort of maximize happiness across the two of us together, given maybe all the other limitations on the number of minutes we get to spend together that might be, I don't know, a little bit less in our control. And I think traditionally, therapists often appropriately, in lots of ways, talk about how do you all spend time together, just the two of you with couples. But I think being careful that just suggesting more time together may add to people's stress, especially if they are experiencing limitations to how much money they have to spend in leisure activities, right? Like how much money I can spend on regular date nights that's going to vary family to family. And so thinking about maybe talking about spending time together and what's important and how that's important, but also how that's important for a particular couple in terms of how they spend that time in ways that don't add stress, but maybe really focus on what makes them both happiest.
Yeah, and I think that is an important conversation and an assumption we should avoid as therapists, thinking like people inherently have a shared understanding of what it means to spend quality time together.
Yeah.
I think, understandably, if there's less time to be spent when you do find it, there's a lot of pressure on that time to really make it count, make it productive. And we don't always, we forget sometimes that being productive doesn't necessarily mean we're enjoying that time, right? There's a distinction there.
Absolutely.
And I think for some, it could be like, yes, if we were productive, I feel really great about that. Whereas others, it's like that time felt really overwhelming and pressure, got a lot done, but I didn't enjoy it, right? And I think this idea of like going through your checklist as a couple is like, we have half an hour in our evening to talk. Let's use it to make sure we're on the same page for the week's activities. That's not maybe for some couples quality time as much as it is like something else, right? So how do they develop a shared understanding? And when they don't have a shared understanding, what does that look like as well? So yeah, it feels like there's a lot of nuanced conversations that need to happen. And as therapists, like avoiding these sort of problem solving without really going through those ideas with the couple seems really important to do.
So last night when I was working up the outline for this podcast, it was in bed on my laptop and my husband was sitting next to me in bed on his laptop. The kids were asleep, the trio, all of them, thankfully. It's amazing. And I said, hey, it's good to spend time together alone without kids, just you and I. He said, does this count? And I said, I think so. I think so. And we both laughed. We both laughed and turned back to our laptop. So nailed it.
Nailed it. Super happy, not at all stressed.
5 minutes.
It is hard. If you have like 100 things on your mind that you need to share with your partner because there's so many shared like things that you have to come to decisions on, like, and yet you're all supposed to use that time to enjoy each other and laugh and just, be present with, how do you fit it all in? It doesn't feel like you have this, the opportunities are not the same for folks who don't have that time. So it feels harder. It feels harder to think about like, how do you make that time count when there's no other time to be had? And does counting matter or as much as it does like really feeling connected? It's just, there's no easy, and there's no real clear, people don't always know what it looks like to like be present and what it means to just connect, like making eye contact with your partner and just staring at each other. For some, that could be very intimate. For others, that could feel like a waste of time. I don't think there are, and I've seen it. I go online sometimes and I see these articles, these blogs of like how to build quality time together. They just tell you what to do. As opposed to, you
better take up hiking because it's everybody's favorite quality time.
Listen,
and leave your kids at the bottom of the mountain because they're just
that is hilarious. You brought that example up. I went hiking last week with Carlos and I almost killed him. It was not a good quality time activity.
Everyone says you should try it, but then you get up there and you are seeing a new side of your partner.
I checked it off the list of quality time things, and then it was definitely not quality time. It was me complaining the whole time about how stressful it was on my body. So yeah, that was a great example. Hiking.
Hiking. Fantastic. Yeah, I am amazed at these people having 2 hours on average alone with their partner every day. That's amazing. Either they're lying or my life is very different. I'm doing something very wrong. It's probably the second option.
It sounded like you were doing something right. Bed laptops. I mean,
Hey, baby.
It worked for you. That's all that matters.
Bed laptops. Then after we had the bed laptop conversation, he said, he pointed at a pile of books that I bought that I haven't read yet. And he said, tell me about those books. And I said, it's none of your business.
Quality time over.
End. Stare at your laptop again. I'm just kidding. All right. So now, go ahead. Sorry, Sesson.
No, I just said easier said than done. This quality time stuff.
Absolutely. So now what should our listeners take away from this study? We talked a little bit about from a therapeutic standpoint, and we know a common recommendation for couples is to go on a date night, like we said. I think it's important to know the economic context of a couple before we make these types of recommendations. And maybe rather than making recommendations of more time together, focus on how to spend quality time together that is quality time from both of their perspectives. As Sesson was saying, think about ways to cope with stress in the home, as we saw that is different for low-income couples. We can focus on ways to reduce feelings of stress during these times they are able to spend together and really maximize that quality time to spend together. And the last take home that I'm very excited about is income is not linked to feeling happy with your spouse. That is lovely. Anything else in the takeaways that you want to make sure our listeners hear?
One thing I didn't mention before, I just wanted to highlight, I think when we're talking about quantity of time and being mindful of it's not as easy as couples hiring a babysitter and finding a way to just sort of escape together without children or the other stressors in their lives. But
right.
I think this idea of being in community, growing your community, strengthening your community is important, because if couples feel like they can lean on others, I think that creates an opportunity for them to turn to each other. And as we, look at people within our communities and how many of them are not surrounded in proximity by family and friends that they, grown up with or who they really have often leaned on maybe in other times in their lives, when it comes to having your own family and not having the financial means perhaps to, create those opportunities for time alone together, really thinking about how do we lean on our village? How do we turn to them and support each other in efforts to try to also build time in for our relationships?
I absolutely love that, especially for our practitioners, like helping your couples find ways to harness existing support, building those communities. Fantastic. Thanks for listening to Attached. As always, a link to the study is in the show notes, and remember to review and rate. That really helps more people find us. So please consider to rate and review Attached on your favorite app. Finally, if you have any relationship questions you want us to talk about, email us at attachedpodcast@gmail.com or get at us on the social medias, all at Attached Podcast. We cannot wait to talk about it. Bye.